What happens when a man who has spent 43 years speaking only to his cattle and the wind suddenly find himself face to face with six strangers who claim they've been searching for him their entire lives? What secrets could a simple rancher hold that would drive people across continents to kneel at his doorstep, tears streaming down their faces as they whisper a single word that changes everything? Father? This is the extraordinary true story of Marcus Sullivan, a weathered cattle rancher from Montana who thought his greatest legacy would be the pristine pastures he'd maintained for nearly half a century. He had no idea that somewhere across the world, six souls carried pieces of his DNA, his eyes, his stubborn chin, and an unquenchable desire to find the man who had unknowingly given them life. In 1978, Marcus was a young soldier stationed overseas, living a life he'd later try to forget. Now, at 68, he was about to discover that some chapters of our lives continue writing themselves long after we think the book is closed. This is a story about the power of blood, the persistence of love, and the moment when a man's carefully constructed solitude crumbles in the face of an impossible truth. The day six strangers appeared at his ranch gate would prove that sometimes the family you never knew you had is the family you needed most. Marcus Sullivan had always believed that a man needed three things to live a good life: honest work, clean air, and enough space between himself and his neighbors to think clearly. At 68, he had perfected this philosophy across 800 acres of Montana rangeland that stretched toward the Rockies like a green carpet dotted with his prized Angus cattle. The morning routine never varied. Marcus rose at 5:30, made coffee black and bitter, and stepped onto his wraparound porch to survey his domain. The silence that greeted him each day wasn't empty. It was full of wind through grass, distant lowing of cattle, and the occasional cry of a red-tailed hawk. This was conversation enough for a man who had spoken more words to his livestock in the past decade than to other human beings. His ranch sat 12 miles from the nearest town of Clearwater, population 847, and even that felt too crowded most days. The mailbox at the end of his mile-long driveway bore only his last name in faded black letters, and the mail carrier, Beth Hendricks, had long since stopped expecting Christmas cards or birthday greetings from the Sullivan place. Marcus had inherited the ranch from his uncle Jeremiah in 1982, for years after returning from his military service overseas. Uncle Jerry had been another solitary soul, a man who understood that sometimes life demanded you build walls not to keep the world out, but to keep yourself in. The old man had seen something broken in his nephew's eyes when Marcus came home, and decided that 800 acres of Montana sky might be the best medicine for whatever wounds the boy was carrying. Those wounds had healed the way prairie grass grows, slowly, quietly, with deep roots that couldn't be easily disturbed. Marcus had spent 43 years perfecting his isolation, building a life so predictable that even the seasons seemed to follow his schedule. Spring meant calving and fence repair. Summer brought hay cutting and long days checking irrigation lines. Fall was shipping time, when he'd reluctantly interact with buyers and truckers, conducting business with handshakes and few words. Winter provided blessed months of solitude, when snowfall could cut him off from the world for weeks at a time. His house reflected his philosophy. The original homestead had been a modest two-bedroom structure, but Marcus had added rooms over the years not for guests, but for the various aspects of his solitary life. A workshop where he repaired equipment and crafted furniture. A library lined with agricultural journals, veterinary manuals, and the complete works of Louis L'Amour. A gun room where he maintained the rifles and shotguns necessary for ranch life. Each room was organized with military precision, everything in its place, nothing superfluous. The kitchen held only what one man needed: a coffee pot that made 8 cups, a cast-iron skillet seasoned to perfection, basic plates and utensils, and a freezer filled with beef from his own cattle. The refrigerator's door was blank except for a single photograph. Uncle Jerry standing next to a prize bull, both of them squinting into the camera with identical expressions of patient endurance. Marcus had few vices and fewer pleasures. He didn't drink alcohol, having seen too many soldiers drown their memories in bottles. He didn't smoke, considering it a waste of money and lungs. His only indulgences were good coffee, leather-bound books, and the satisfaction of watching his cattle graze in pastures that grew more beautiful each year under his careful stewardship. Women had shown interest over the years. Sarah Martinez from the feed store had brought him homemade pies for 3 consecutive Thanksgivings before accepting that his polite gratitude would never develop into anything more. The widow Thompson had hired him to fix her fences twice, jobs that clearly didn't require professional attention, before understanding that Marcus Sullivan wasn't a man who could be lured into companionship with apple turnovers and meaningful glances. He wasn't cruel in his rejection of these overtures, just definitively uninterested. Marcus had learned that some wounds heal best in solitude, and some men are meant to walk through life alone. He'd made his peace with that truth decades ago, finding contentment in the rhythms of ranch life and the honest companionship of animals that expected nothing but food, water, and basic care. His social interactions were limited to necessary business. Dr. Patricia Vance, the local veterinarian, knew him as a competent rancher who called only when genuinely needed and paid his bills promptly. Tom Bradley at the hardware store recognized Marcus's truck and had his usual orders ready without conversation: fence wire, salt blocks, equipment parts. Even his banking was conducted through mail and online systems, eliminating the need for small talk with tellers who might ask about his weekend plans or vacation ideas. The closest Marcus came to friendship was his relationship with Frank Morrison, a neighboring rancher who understood the value of comfortable silence. Once a month, Frank would drive over to discuss cattle prices, weather patterns, or equipment recommendations. Their conversations were factual exchanges between professionals, never personal revelations or emotional discussions. When Frank's wife died 2 years earlier, Marcus had attended the funeral, sitting in the back row and leaving immediately after the service without approaching the widower. A week later, he'd deliver a side of beef to Frank's freezer with a note that simply read, "Good cattle, no charge." Frank understood this gesture better than any condolence card. The animals on his ranch knew Marcus better than any human. His cattle recognized his approach and would gather when they saw his truck, not from fear but from trust built over years of consistent care. His border collie, Rex, had died 3 years earlier at the age of 14, and Marcus had buried him on a hillside overlooking the pasture where they'd worked together for so many years. He hadn't replaced Rex, deciding that some partnerships were too unique to duplicate. Evenings followed the same pattern. Dinner at 6, usually something simple prepared from ingredients grown or raised on the ranch. The evening news on an old television that received 3 clear channels. Reading until 9:30, then bed by 10. Marcus slept well, the deep sleep of a man whose conscience was clear and whose body was properly tired from honest work. His bedroom contained only essentials: a bed built from pine he'd cut and seasoned himself, a dresser that held clothes purchased for function rather than fashion, and a single window that faced east toward the sunrise. No photographs, no mementos, no evidence of a life lived anywhere but within these ranch boundaries. Sundays were the most solitary days. With no cattle auctions or business to conduct, Marcus would often spend entire days without speaking aloud. He'd walk his property lines, checking fence integrity and water sources, or work in his shop building furniture he didn't need, but found satisfaction in creating. His hands had grown skilled over the decades, producing tables, chairs, and cabinets of surprising quality that he'd occasionally donate anonymously to the church in Clearwater. The people of Clearwater had long since accepted Marcus Sullivan as a local fixture, like the old grain elevator or the war memorial in the town square. Children dared each other to deliver mail to the scary hermit's house, but adults knew better. Marcus wasn't scary. He was simply a man who had chosen a different path, and small-town wisdom dictated that such choices should be respected as long as they didn't harm others. His financial situation was comfortable without being wealthy. The ranch generated steady income from cattle sales and hay production. His expenses were minimal: equipment maintenance, property taxes, basic utilities, and the simple food and clothing necessary for ranch life. He'd accumulated enough savings to weather bad years and even help neighbors during difficult times, though such assistance was always offered anonymously through intermediaries. Marcus had no will, no life insurance, no plans for the future beyond maintaining his cattle operation season by season. The ranch would eventually revert to the state or be sold to pay taxes, but that seemed like someone else's problem. He lived in the present tense, focused on immediate tasks and seasonal responsibilities, never looking beyond the next calving season or hay harvest. Medical care was another area where Marcus practiced extreme self-reliance. He treated his own cuts, sprains, and minor illnesses with the same practical approach he applied to veterinary work on his cattle. His medicine cabinet contained antibiotics, painkillers, and basic surgical supplies that would stock a small clinic. Only once in 43 years had he required hospitalization, when a bull had broken 3 of his ribs. Even then, he'd driven himself to the emergency room and checked himself out against medical advice as soon as the bones were set. The isolation that others might find unbearable had become Marcus's greatest comfort. He'd forgotten the anxiety that came with social obligations, the exhaustion of maintaining relationships, the complications that arose when other people's needs intersected with personal plans. His life had achieved a purity that monks might envy. Every action purposeful, every day productive, every decision his alone to make. As autumn approached his 68th year, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life lived according to one's own principles. His cattle were healthy, his pastures were in excellent condition, and his equipment was well maintained. The approaching winter would provide months of peaceful solitude, time to read and plan for the next year's operations. He had no way of knowing that this carefully constructed life was about to change forever. No premonition that his decades of solitude were being measured in days rather than years. No sense that somewhere across the world, 6 people were making final preparations for a journey that would shatter his peaceful isolation like a stone through window glass. The last evening of his old life passed like thousands of others, quiet, predictable, and utterly alone. Marcus read until his usual bedtime, turned off the lights, and settled into sleep surrounded by the familiar sounds of wind and cattle. Tomorrow would bring the same routine that had sustained him for decades, or so he believed. But tomorrow would also bring visitors whose very existence would force Marcus to confront the one chapter of his life he'd spent 43 years trying to forget. The morning of October 15th started like any other in Marcus Sullivan's carefully ordered world. Coffee at 5:30, weather check from the porch, and a slow walk to the barn to begin his daily routine. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the cattle moved lazily through pastures touched with frost. Rex would have loved this weather, Marcus thought briefly, then pushed the memory aside as he always did when thoughts threatened to become feelings. By 8 o'clock, he was repairing a section of fence damaged by a fallen tree when he noticed dust rising from his private road. Visitors were so rare that Marcus stopped working and shaded his eyes against the morning sun. A vehicle was approaching, moving slowly as if the driver was uncertain of the destination. Marcus felt the familiar tension that came with unexpected human contact, but he continued his work, hoping whoever it was would realize their mistake and turn around. The vehicle didn't turn around. As it drew closer, Marcus could see it was a rental van, the kind used for airport shuttles or large family trips. His unease deepened. No one he knew drove such vehicles, and no one he knew would visit without calling first. Well, no one would call first because no one had his phone number except for emergency services and essential business contacts. The van stopped at his gate, which was closed but unlocked. Marcus watched from a distance as the driver's door opened and a woman stepped out. Even from 50 yards away, he could see she was nervous, looking back at the van as if consulting with passengers before approaching the gate. She was young, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back severely and clothes that suggested she'd traveled a long distance. Marcus set down his tools and walked toward the gate, his stride measured and his expression neutral. Decades of isolation had taught him the importance of controlling first impressions. Show no weakness, offer no encouragement for extended conversation, and most people would state their business quickly and leave. "Excuse me," the woman called out when she saw him approaching. Her voice carried an accent Marcus couldn't immediately place, something European, but not quite. "Are you Marcus Sullivan?" The use of his full name sent a chill through him. Very few people knew both his first and last names, and none of them would send strangers to his ranch. "Depends who's asking," he replied, stopping a comfortable distance from the gate. The woman's composure cracked slightly. She looked back at the van again, and Marcus noticed movement behind the tinted windows. Multiple passengers, then. This was getting worse by the minute. "My name is Elena Costas," she said, stepping closer to the gate. "I've come a very long way to meet you." "We all have." Marcus said nothing, waiting for her to explain herself. He learned that silence often encouraged people to reveal their real intentions faster than questions would. "I believe," Elena continued, her accent becoming more pronounced as her nervousness increased, "that you are my father." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, and he had to consciously steady himself against the fence post. "Father." The word echoed in his mind, dragging up memories he'd spent decades burying. Greece, 1978. A young soldier on shore leave. A girl with dark eyes, and a smile that had made him forget, temporarily, that he was damaged goods. "I think you have a wrong man," he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. Elena shook her head. "Marcus Sullivan, born in Billings, Montana, on March 12, 1955. Served in the Navy from 1976 to 1980. Stationed at the NATO base in Suda Bay, Crete, from June 1977 to September 1978. She paused, studying his face. "You knew my mother, Sophia Costas. You knew her well." The name brought it all back in a rush that nearly buckled his knees. Sophia. Beautiful, laughing Sophia with her wild hair and fierce independence. The girl who had shown him kindness when he needed it most, who had made him feel human again after months of numbness following combat operations that still visited him in dreams. Marcus's carefully constructed defenses began to crumble. This woman had Sophia's eyes, the same deep brown that seemed to hold secrets, the same stubborn tilt to her chin, the same way of standing with her weight on one foot, as if ready to bolt at any moment. "Sophia," he said quietly, the name feeling strange on lips that hadn't spoken it in over 4 decades. Elena's face brightened with relief. "You remember her." "I remember a lot of things I wish I could forget." Marcus looked past her to the van. "Who else is with you?" "My brothers and sisters," Elena said. "We've all been looking for you for years." Brothers and sisters? The words came out harsher than Marcus intended. The implications were staggering. One unexpected child was a shock. Multiple children suggested a relationship far more serious than the brief romance he remembered. Elena nodded. 6 of us altogether. We were all born in 1978 and 1979. Mama never told us about you until she was dying 2 years ago. That's when she gave us your name and what little information she had about your military service. Marcus felt the world spinning around him. 6 children, 6 human beings who shared his DNA, walking around in the world while he'd lived in blissful ignorance. The mathematical impossibility of it struck him first. Sophia couldn't have had 6 children in such a short time span unless... Twins, he said, understanding flooding through him. Triplets, actually, Elena corrected. 2 sets of triplets, 13 months apart. The doctor said it was extraordinarily rare, especially with no family history of multiple births. Marcus staggered backward, leaning heavily against his fence post. 2 sets of triplets. In his genetics class in high school, he learned that multiple births often ran in families through the father's line. His grandmother had been a twin, something he'd never thought much about until this moment. "I need to sit down," he said, more to himself than to Elena. She immediately became concerned, her maternal instincts overriding her nervousness. "Are you all right? Should I call someone?" "No," Marcus said sharply. "No doctors. No calling anyone." He looked at her again, really seeing her for the first time. She was beautiful in the same way Sophia had been, but there was something else in her face, intelligence, determination, and a strength that suggested life hadn't been easy. "How did you find me?" Elena smiled for the first time, and Marcus saw his own rare smile reflected in her features. "It took 2 years and a private investigator, but military records eventually led us to Montana, and property records led us here." "Us," Marcus repeated. "There are 5 others in that van." "Yes. We've all traveled here together. Some of us came from very far away." Marcus looked at the van with new eyes. Inside were 5 more people who shared his blood, who had grown up without him, who had apparently spent considerable time and money to track him down. The isolation he'd treasured for decades suddenly felt selfish and hollow. "What do they want?" he asked. Elena's expression grew serious. "The same thing I want. To meet our father, to understand where we came from, to fill in the missing pieces of our lives." Marcus walked closer to the gate, studying Elena's face for signs of deception or ulterior motives. He found none. She seemed genuinely nervous, genuinely hopeful, and genuinely prepared for rejection. "Your mother," he said. "What happened to her?" Elena's eyes filled with tears. "She died of cancer 2 years ago. She was a good mother, but she never married. She raised us alone, working 3 jobs sometimes to keep us fed and housed. She was strong, but it was hard." Guilt crashed over Marcus like a physical weight. While he'd been living in comfortable solitude, Sophia had struggled to raise 6 children alone. He could have helped, should have helped, if he'd known. "She never tried to contact me?" Elena shook her head. She said, "You were a good man who was dealing with his own pain. She didn't want to add to your burdens. But before she died, she made us promise that if we ever found you, we would tell you that she never regretted loving you, even briefly." Marcus closed his eyes, overwhelmed by emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. Love, guilt, regret, and something else, curiosity about these people who carried his genetic legacy into the world. "Open the gate," he said finally. Elena's face lit up with joy. "Really? You'll meet them? I can't very well leave them sitting in a van all morning," Marcus replied, attempting to maintain his gruff exterior while his inner world underwent seismic shifts. Elena hurried back to the van, and Marcus could see animated conversation through the windows. One by one, 5 more people emerged, and Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. They were all clearly adults, but they moved with the hesitant excitement of children on Christmas morning. 3 men and 2 women, plus Elena. As they approached the gate, Marcus began to see the family resemblances that connected them not just to Sophia, but to himself. The tall, lean build that ran in the Sullivan line. The way they all seemed to study their surroundings with careful attention to detail. The stubborn set to their jaws that Marcus recognized from his own mirror. Elena performed introductions as they gathered at the gate. "This is Dmitri," she said, indicating a man in his mid-40s with graying temples and calloused hands. "He's a carpenter in Athens." Dmitri stepped forward and extended his hand through the gate. "It is an honor to meet you, sir," he said in heavily accented English. Marcus shook his son's hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. Dmitri had the look of a man who worked with his hands, someone who understood the satisfaction of building things that lasted. "This is Yorgos," Elena continued, introducing a slightly smaller man with intense eyes and ink-stained fingers. "He's a journalist in London." Yorgos offered a nervous smile. "I write for newspapers," he explained unnecessarily, as if afraid Marcus might not approve of his profession. The third man was introduced as Alexis, and Marcus felt a shock of recognition. Alexis could have been Marcus himself at 30, down to the way he held his shoulders and the skeptical expression in his eyes. I'm a cattle rancher in Australia, Alexis said simply. A rancher? Marcus couldn't hide his surprise. Alexis nodded. Started with nothing 12 years ago. Now, I run 2,000 head on property, about half this size. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Of all the professions his unknown children might have chosen, one had gravitated toward the same isolated, animal-focused life that had sustained Marcus for decades. Elena introduced the two other women. Maria, a teacher from Italy with gentle eyes and a warm smile, and Anna, who had traveled from Germany and worked as a veterinary assistant. Each profession seemed to echo some aspect of Marcus's own interests or abilities. Dimitri's craftsmanship, Yorgos's attention to detail, Alexis's affinity for animals, Maria's patience, and his medical knowledge. As they stood at his gate, Marcus realized he was looking at 6 successful, educated adults who had made good lives for themselves despite growing up without a father. Pride, an emotion he hadn't experienced in decades, swelled in his chest. "You all came together?" he asked. "We've been planning this trip for 6 months," Elena explained. "We wanted to meet as siblings first, then find you together." Marcus looked at the van, then at his small house, mentally calculating space and logistics. 6 unexpected house guests would shatter his routine completely, but turning them away seemed impossible now that he'd seen their faces. "I don't have accommodations for 6 people," he said carefully. "We've booked rooms at a motel in Clearwater," Maria said quickly. "We don't want to impose. We just hope to spend some time with you, to talk, to get to know each other a little." Marcus nodded slowly. These people had traveled thousands of miles and spent considerable money for the chance to meet him. The least he could do was offer them coffee and honest conversation. "Come up to the house," he said, opening the gate. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." As 6 strangers who carried his blood walked onto his property for the first time, Marcus Sullivan realized that his decades of careful isolation were about to become a memory. Whether that change would prove to be blessing or catastrophe remained to be seen, but there was no going back now. The solitary chapter of his life had just ended, and he had no idea how to write the next one. The walk from the gate to Marcus's house passed in surreal silence. 6 pairs of feet created an unfamiliar rhythm on the gravel path that Marcus had walked alone for decades. He found himself hyper-aware of every detail. The way Dimitri's eyes cataloged the ranch buildings with professional interest, how Anna automatically assessed the health of cattle grazing nearby, and the reverent way they all looked at the landscape that had shaped their father's life. Marcus's modest house had never felt smaller. The front porch that normally provided him with peaceful solitude now seemed inadequate to accommodate 7 adults. He paused at his front door, suddenly aware that these people were about to see the intimate details of his carefully constructed isolation. "Coffee," he offered, the word coming out rougher than intended. The universal acceptance told him that his children were as nervous as he was. They filed into his living room, moving carefully as if afraid to disturb the museum of his solitary life. Marcus watched them absorb the sparse furnishings, the absence of photographs, the complete lack of personal mementos that might have told them something about the man they'd spent years searching for. Elena sat on the edge of his sofa, still clearly designated as their spokesperson. The others arranged themselves around the room with the careful politeness of people who understood they were in sacred space, even if that space felt austere and unwelcoming. Marcus escaped to his kitchen, grateful for a few minutes to process what was happening. As he prepared coffee for 7 instead of 1, his hands moved automatically while his mind reeled. 2 sets of triplets, 6 adult children, 45 years of unknowing fatherhood that had just collapsed into a single morning of revelation. When he returned with mugs and a pot of coffee, he found his children studying his sparse bookshelves with intense curiosity. Yorgos was examining his collection of agricultural journals, while Maria had discovered his small section of classic literature. Anna was looking at veterinary texts with professional interest, and Alexis stood before the window that overlooked his pastures with the concentrated attention of someone evaluating livestock operations. "You have a beautiful ranch," Dimitri said, accepting his coffee with careful formality. The buildings are well maintained. Good craftsmanship. Marcus nodded, unsure how to respond to compliments from a son he'd just met. Built most of the additions myself, he said finally. I thought so, Dmitri replied with approval. The joinery work is excellent. You learned carpentry in the military. Some, Marcus said. Mostly taught myself from books and trial and error. The conversation felt stilted and strange, but beneath the surface tension, Marcus sensed genuine interest from these people who shared his DNA. They weren't here for money or dramatic confrontations. They seemed authentically curious about the man who had unknowingly contributed to their existence. Elena set down her coffee and reached in her bag. We brought some things we thought you might want to see, she said, pulling out a thick photo album. Pictures of Mama and of us growing up. Marcus accepted the album with hands that trembled slightly. The first photograph nearly stopped his heart. Sophia at 19, holding a baby who could only be Elena, both of them smiling despite the obvious poverty of their surroundings. Sophia looked exactly as Marcus remembered her, beautiful, defiant, and strong. He turned the page and found himself looking at two babies who were unmistakably identical. Dmitri and Yorgos as infants, their serious expressions already suggesting the thoughtful men they would become. Another page showed Sophia pregnant again, her belly round with what Marcus now knew were the second set of triplets. She was so young, he said quietly, studying Sophia's face in photograph after photograph. 20 when Elena was born, Maria confirmed. 21 when Alexis, Anna, and I arrived. She used to joke that she got all her childbearing done efficiently, but I think it was harder than she let on. Marcus continued through the album, watching his unknown children grow from babies to toddlers to school-age kids. Sophia appeared in every photo, aging visibly under the stress of single motherhood, but never losing the spark that had attracted Marcus decades earlier. The children looked happy despite their circumstances, dressed in clothes that were clean but obviously secondhand, always clustered together like a pack of loyal siblings. She never married? Marcus asked, though Elena had already answered this question. No, Anna replied. She had opportunities, but she always said she'd rather struggle alone than settle for someone who didn't understand her children's special needs. Special needs? Elena smiled. 6 children born 13 months apart. We were quite a handful. Mama used to say that raising triplets twice was like running a very small, very chaotic boarding school. Marcus found photographs from school events, birthdays celebrated with homemade cakes, and handmade gifts, and family vacations that consisted of picnics in local parks. The poverty was evident, but so was the love. Sophia had clearly devoted her entire life to raising these children, working multiple jobs while ensuring they felt secure and valued. What did she tell you about me? Marcus asked, looking up from a photograph of all 6 children at what appeared to be Elena's university graduation. That you were a good man dealing with difficult things, Elena said. She said you were kind to her when you didn't have to be, and that she understood why you left without looking back. Marcus felt the familiar weight of old guilt. I didn't know she was pregnant. If I had known, she never wanted you to know, Yorgos interrupted gently. She made that very clear before she died. She said you were carrying enough pain already, and she didn't want to add to your burdens. The conversation revealed the depth of Sophia's sacrifice and wisdom. She had protected Marcus from knowledge that would have complicated his already troubled readjustment to civilian life, while simultaneously taking on the enormous responsibility of raising 6 children alone. Tell me about your mother's last years, Marcus said, setting aside the photo album. Maria wiped tears from her eyes. Cancer took her quickly, which was perhaps a mercy. She was still working 2 jobs at 63, still sending care packages to whichever of us needed them most. Even during treatment, she worried more about us than herself. She died in my home in Italy, Maria continued. All of us were there at the end. Her last words were instructions about finding you. She made us promise that if we ever located you, we would tell you that loving you was one of the few perfect things in her life, even though it was brief. Marcus struggled to maintain his composure. 45 years of careful emotional control threatened to crumble under the weight of this revelation. Sophia had carried his memory as a treasured secret while building a life of extraordinary generosity and sacrifice. "You all stayed in touch?" he asked, desperate to change the subject before grief overwhelmed him. "We've always been close," Alexis said. "Growing up, we had to depend on each other. That bond never weakened, even when life scattered us across different continents." Anna pulled out her phone and showed Marcus recent photographs of the siblings together. "We try to gather every few years, usually at Maria's place in Italy. When Mama died, we made a pact to never lose touch with each other again." Marcus studied the recent photos, seeing successful, confident adults who had clearly maintained the tight family bonds forged in their difficult childhood. Elena ran a small restaurant in Athens. Dmitri had built a successful construction business. Yorgos wrote for respected international newspapers. Maria taught elementary school, while raising 3 children of her own. Anna managed a veterinary clinic in Munich, and Alexis had created a cattle operation that impressed even Marcus's professional eye. "You've all done well for yourselves," he said, and meant it. "Mama made sure we understood the value of education and hard work," Elena replied. "She never let us use our circumstances as excuses for not reaching our potential." The conversation continued through the morning, revealing the remarkable woman Sophia had become and the exceptional children she had raised. Marcus found himself both proud of their achievements and devastated by his absence from their lives. These were people he would have been honored to call family, if circumstances had been different. Around noon, practical concerns intruded. The siblings exchanged glances, and Elena cleared her throat diplomatically. "We don't want to overwhelm you," she said. "We know this is a lot to process. We were hoping to stay in the area for a few days to spend time getting to know each other, but only if you're comfortable with that." Marcus looked around his living room, seeing it through new eyes. For decades, this space had been his sanctuary, perfectly organized for a life of solitude. Now it felt almost sacred in a different way. The place where he'd first met his children, where family relationships had begun to form despite impossible odds. "How long can you stay?" he asked. "We've arranged for 2 weeks," Dmitri said. "Some of us had to use vacation time, but we wanted enough time to really talk, to learn about each other." 2 weeks. 14 days of having his routine completely disrupted, his privacy invaded, his carefully maintained isolation shattered. Marcus should have felt panic at the prospect. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: anticipation. "The motel in Clearwater is adequate?" he asked. "It's fine," Maria assured him quickly. "We just want to spend time with you during the days, if you're willing." Marcus stood and walked to his window, looking out at the ranch that had been his entire world for so long. The cattle grazed peacefully, unaware that their owner's life had just undergone a fundamental transformation. The autumn light slanted across pastures that had provided him with solitude and peace for decades. "I have work that needs doing," he said finally. "Fence repairs, equipment maintenance, winter preparations. If you're staying, you might as well make yourselves useful." The silence behind him stretched long enough that Marcus turned around, worried he'd somehow offended them. Instead, he found 6 faces bright with joy and relief. "You want us to help with ranch work?" Elena asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Can't very well have 6 healthy adults standing around watching one old man work," Marcus replied gruffly. "Assuming any of you know the difference between a hammer and a horse." Alexis laughed, the first genuinely relaxed sound any of them had made since arriving. "I think we can manage to be useful," he said. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of tension he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. These people weren't here to judge him or demand explanations for his choices. They simply wanted to know him, to be part of his life for whatever time they could share. "All right then," he said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. "Welcome to the ranch." For the first time in 45 years, Marcus Sullivan was no longer alone. The first week of having 6 adult children on his ranch tested every assumption Marcus had made about himself and his capacity for human connection. What he'd expected to be awkward and overwhelming gradually transformed into something he hadn't experienced since his youth: the satisfying rhythm of shared work and emerging family bonds. Alexis proved to be invaluable with the cattle operations. His experience managing his own herd in Australia translated easily to Montana conditions, and Marcus found himself genuinely impressed with his son's knowledge of animal husbandry, pasture management, and breeding strategies. They spent long hours working together, their conversation gradually shifting from polite exchanges to the easy communication between professionals who respected each other's expertise. "Your breeding program is excellent," Alexis said on the third morning as they checked a pregnant heifer. "The genetic lines you've developed here are as good as anything I've seen." Marcus felt an unexpected surge of pride. Praise from strangers meant nothing to him, but approval from someone who understood the work felt significant. "Took 20 years to get the bloodlines where I wanted them," he admitted. "It shows in the quality of the animals," Alexis replied, running an experienced hand over the heifer's flank. "These cattle will command premium prices at market." They worked in comfortable silence after that, each man recognizing in the other a shared understanding of the patience and dedication required to build something lasting. Marcus began teaching Alexis the specific details of his operation: which pastures produced the best grass at different times of year, how he rotated his herds to maintain soil health, and the careful breeding records he'd maintained for 2 decades. Dmitri attacked the ranch's maintenance needs with professional enthusiasm. The carpenter in him couldn't ignore the minor repairs that Marcus had been postponing, and he quickly organized a comprehensive improvement plan that would have taken Marcus months to complete alone. "This barn needs new support beams," Dmitri announced after a thorough inspection. "The foundation is solid, but some of the framing is showing stress. With your permission, I'd like to reinforce the structure before winter." Marcus found himself nodding agreement to projects he'd considered unnecessary luxuries. With skilled help available, tasks that had seemed overwhelming became manageable, even enjoyable. Dmitri worked with the focused intensity of a craftsman who took pride in his trade, and Marcus appreciated both the quality of the work and the methodical approach. "Where did you learn to work with wood?" Marcus asked, watching Dmitri precisely measure cuts for new support beams. "Started as a boy helping my uncle repair boats," Dmitri replied, his accent softening as he became more comfortable. "Mama insisted we all learn practical skills. She said we needed to be able to take care of ourselves and help others." The wisdom of Sophia's parenting became more apparent each day. She had raised 6 children who approached challenges with competence and cooperation, who worked hard without complaint, and who instinctively understood the satisfaction that came from building and maintaining things of value. Anna quickly appointed herself as the ranch veterinarian, conducting a comprehensive health assessment of Marcus's cattle herd. Her professional knowledge impressed him, and her gentle approach with the animals demonstrated the same intuitive understanding that had made Marcus successful with livestock. "Your vaccination protocols are excellent," she reported after examining several animals. "The herd is remarkably healthy for its size. You've clearly invested significant time in preventive care. Can't afford to lose animals to preventable diseases," Marcus replied, but he was pleased by her professional approval. Anna began updating his veterinary records with systematic thoroughness, creating detailed health profiles for each animal that would help Marcus make better management decisions. Her quiet competence and genuine love for animals created an easy working relationship that felt natural despite their recent meeting. Yorgos proved unexpectedly useful in helping Marcus organize his financial records and business operations. The journalist's attention to detail and analytical skills revealed inefficiencies in Marcus's record-keeping that had cost him money over the years. "You're not claiming several legitimate business deductions," Yorgos explained, spreading Marcus's tax documents across the kitchen table. "Equipment depreciation feed costs, veterinary expenses, properly documented, these could significantly reduce your tax burden. Marcus had always approached his finances with the same straightforward simplicity he applied to everything else. Pay bills promptly, maintain sufficient reserves for emergencies, and avoid complications. Yorgos's systematic analysis revealed opportunities for optimization without sacrificing Marcus's preference for uncomplicated operations. Why does a journalist know so much about tax law? Marcus asked, genuinely curious. Yorgos smiled. Investigative reporting requires understanding how money flows through various systems. Tax structures often reveal important truths about businesses and individuals. Maria appointed herself as the ranch's unofficial social coordinator and nutritionist. She quickly recognized that Marcus's bachelor cooking skills, while adequate for one person, needed significant upgrading to feed 7 adults properly. Without making a fuss about it, she began preparing elaborate meals using ingredients she purchased during trips to town. "You have excellent beef," she announced after preparing their first dinner together, "but you need vegetables and variety in your diet." Marcus protested that he'd managed fine for decades on simple meals, but he had to admit that Maria's cooking was extraordinary. She had inherited Sophia's ability to create satisfying meals from basic ingredients, though Maria's Italian training had added sophistication to the simple, hearty dishes that had sustained the family during their childhood. Elena emerged as the natural diplomat, mediating the occasional disagreements that arose when 6 strong-willed adults worked together on unfamiliar projects. Her restaurant management experience had taught her how to coordinate multiple personalities toward common goals, and she applied those skills to organizing their daily activities. Dmitri wants to rebuild the barn door, but Alexis thinks we should prioritize fence repairs, she reported to Marcus on the 4th morning. "What's your preference?" Marcus realized that having Elena manage these decisions freed him to focus on the work itself rather than the logistics of coordination. Her diplomatic skills created harmony among siblings who were still learning to work together, despite their lifelong bonds. The evenings became the most remarkable part of each day. After dinner, the family would gather in Marcus's living room, which had somehow expanded to accommodate 7 people despite no physical changes to the space. The conversations that emerged during these sessions revealed the depth of connection that had developed between siblings who had grown up together and gradually began to include Marcus as more than just an observer. They shared stories about their childhood that painted a picture of Sophia's remarkable parenting under difficult circumstances. Elena described how their mother had turned their small apartment into a classroom, teaching them to read before they started school and insisting on homework completed at the kitchen table every evening. Dmitri told stories about building furniture from salvaged wood, projects that had taught him carpentry skills while providing their family with essential household items. Anna shared memories of helping their mother care for neighborhood animals when veterinary care was too expensive, experiences that had sparked her interest in veterinary medicine. Alexis described how Sophia had encouraged his fascination with farm animals during school trips, even though they lived in urban poverty far from any agricultural operations. Yorgos recalled how their mother had saved money to buy him a used typewriter when he showed interest in writing, supporting his journalism aspirations despite having no understanding of the profession herself. Maria told stories about cooking with Sophia, learning the recipes that had been passed down through generations of women who had made much from very little. Each story revealed Sophia's determination to nurture her children's individual talents, despite the constraints of single motherhood and limited resources. Marcus found himself both amazed by her wisdom and devastated by his absence from these formative experiences. "She sounds like an extraordinary woman," he said one evening after particularly touching stories about Sophia's encouragement of each child's educational goals. "She was," Elena replied simply, "but she always said that raising us was the easy part because we had each other. She worried most about the children who faced challenges alone." Marcus recognized himself in that description, and He wondered if Sophia's concern for isolated children had been partly motivated by thoughts of the solitary father she'd left behind in Montana. As the days passed, Marcus began to understand that his children's visit was changing him in fundamental ways. His rigid routines softened to accommodate their needs and preferences. His sparse house became warm and lively with the sounds of multiple conversations, shared meals, and collaborative work. His carefully maintained emotional distance gradually dissolved as genuine affection developed between people who had been strangers a week earlier. The work they accomplished together exceeded anything Marcus could have achieved alone. Dimitri's construction improvements would add years to the life of his buildings. Anna's veterinary care enhanced the health and productivity of his herd. Alexis's operational insights improved the efficiency of his cattle management. Yorgos's financial analysis increased his profitability. Elena's coordination skills made complex projects manageable. Maria's cooking improved his nutrition and quality of life. But the most significant changes weren't practical, they were emotional. Marcus rediscovered the satisfaction of teaching skills to eager students, the pleasure of shared accomplishments, and the unexpected joy of belonging to something larger than himself. His children weren't visitors anymore. They were family in the truest sense, people who had chosen to include him in their lives despite having every reason to resent his absence. On the seventh night, as the family gathered for dinner around Marcus's kitchen table, he looked at the faces illuminated by candlelight and realized that his house had become a home in a way it had never been during his decades of solitude. These people had given him something he hadn't known he was missing, the profound satisfaction of being needed and valued by others who shared his blood and, increasingly, his affection. "Tomorrow," he announced, "I want to show you the property boundaries. All of it. There are places on this ranch you haven't seen yet, places that tell the story of how this land became what it is." His children exchanged pleased glances, understanding that this was an invitation to something deeper than casual sightseeing. Marcus was offering to share the intimate knowledge of place that had sustained him for decades, to include them in a legacy he'd never expected to pass on to anyone. As they began planning the next day's exploration, Marcus felt a profound shift in his understanding of inheritance. He'd always assumed that his ranch would eventually pass to strangers who wouldn't understand its history or appreciate the careful stewardship that had shaped it over decades. Now he could see the possibility of a different future, one where the land he'd protected and improved might remain in the hands of people who would value it properly. The second week of their visit promised to deepen connections that were already transforming everyone involved. Marcus Sullivan was learning that family wasn't just about shared DNA. It was about choosing to build something together, to invest in relationships that created mutual benefit and lasting joy. For the first time in decades, he was excited about the future. The second week began with Marcus leading his children on horseback across the 800 acres he'd called home for 4 decades. He'd borrowed horses from Frank Morrison's ranch, explaining to his puzzled neighbor that he had family visiting. The first time Frank had heard Marcus mention any relatives in 20 years of acquaintance. Watching his children learn to ride filled Marcus with unexpected pride. Alexis, predictably, took to horseback naturally, his experience with Australian cattle operations translating easily to Montana terrain. The others struggled initially, but showed the same determined persistence that had characterized their approach to ranch work all week. "This is where the original homestead stood," Marcus explained, dismounting near a small grove of cottonwood trees. Scattered foundation stones and a few weathered fence posts were all that remained of the house his great-grandfather had built in 1889. "3 generations of Sullivans worked this land before me." Elena walked among the stones, tried to imagine the lives that had been lived in this remote spot. "What happened to them?" "My grandfather sold out in 1943 and moved to town. Said farming was too hard and too lonely for a man with options." Marcus looked across the pasture where his cattle now grazed. "Uncle Jerry bought the place back in 1955, said the land needed Sullivans on it." Anna knelt beside an old apple tree, its gnarled trunk still producing fruit despite decades of neglect. Someone planted this deliberately, she observed. They were planning to stay. Great-grandmother's apple tree, Marcus confirmed. She died in 1918 during the flu pandemic, but the tree keeps producing. Uncle Jerry used to say it was her way of reminding us that some things endure even when the people who created them are gone. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of them. Marcus was showing them not just property boundaries, but family history, connecting them to roots they'd never known existed. Yorgos took notes and photographs, his journalist instincts recognizing material for a story worth preserving. They rode to the highest point on the ranch, where a small cemetery contained 4 weathered headstones marking the graves of Sullivans who had chosen to be buried on the land they'd loved. Marcus had never visited this spot with another person, but today it felt appropriate to share this most intimate part of his heritage. Uncle Jerry's buried here, Marcus said, pointing to the newest grave. He left instructions that he wanted to stay on the ranch permanently. Dmitri studied the headstones with professional interest. The craftsmanship is excellent. Hand-carved marble, probably local work. I carved Jerry's stone myself, Marcus admitted. Seemed like something family should do for family. The implications hung in the air. Marcus had considered Jerry to be the last Sullivan who would care about this land, but now 6 new people carried the family name and bloodline forward into an uncertain future. Maria picked wildflowers and placed them on each grave, a spontaneous gesture that touched Marcus deeply. She had inherited Sophia's instinct for honoring memory and creating connection across generations. They would have loved meeting you, Marcus said, surprising himself with the emotional openness of the statement. Do you think Mama would have approved of us coming here? Elena asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. Sophia understood that some choices can't be unmade, but their consequences can still bring unexpected blessings. I think she'd be pleased to know that you found me, and that we found each other. The ride back to headquarters passed in contemplative silence, each person processing the significance of what they'd experienced. Marcus had shared more than family history. He'd offered them a place in a legacy that stretched back 5 generations and forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. That evening, practical discussions began about the logistics of maintaining relationships across vast distances. Elena would return to Athens in 4 days, Dmitri to his construction business, Yorgos to London newspaper deadlines, Maria to her teaching position, and her own children, Anna to her veterinary clinic, and Alexis to his cattle operation in Australia. We could establish regular communication schedules, Yorgos suggested, his organizational mind already working on solutions. Email updates, monthly video calls, annual gatherings. Marcus felt the familiar anxiety of pending solitude, but it was tempered by genuine sadness at losing the daily companionship he'd learned to value. You're all welcome back anytime, he said simply. This will always be your home too, for as long as you want it to be. Anna had been unusually quiet during dinner, and, finally, spoke up with obvious nervousness. I've been thinking about making a more significant change, she said. My position in Munich is stable, but it's not particularly fulfilling. I wondered if you might need a partner here on the ranch. The suggestion stunned Marcus into silence. Anna hurried to explain her thinking. You could use veterinary services on a full-time basis, and I could help with the business operations. The ranch is large enough to support 2 people if it's managed efficiently. I've saved enough money to invest in improvements, and my German degree would transfer to Montana veterinary licensing requirements. Marcus stared at his daughter, trying to process the implications of her proposal. A permanent partner on the ranch would fundamentally change his life, but it would also ensure that the Sullivan legacy continued with someone who understood both the land and his vision for its future. You'd give up your life in Germany to live here? He asked. Anna nodded. I've been thinking about this all week. I love animals, I understand ranch operations, and I like to be close to family for the first time in my adult life. But only if you want a partner, not just help. The word partner carried enormous significance. Marcus had been the sole decision-maker on his ranch for 43 years, accountable to no one except his own standards. Sharing authority would require adjustments he'd never considered necessary. But Anna had proven herself competent, trustworthy, and compatible with his working style. More importantly, she seemed to genuinely love the land and understand its requirements. The ranch would benefit from her professional veterinary knowledge, and Marcus had to admit that he'd enjoyed having skilled help with the endless work required by a large cattle operation. "We need to work out legal arrangements," he said carefully. "Property ownership, profit sharing, decision-making authority." Anna smiled with relief. "I've already researched Montana partnership law. We could structure it as a gradual transition over several years, with full partnership when you're ready to retire." Alexis spoke up unexpectedly. "I'd like to explore something similar," he said. "My Australian operation is profitable, but I'm interested in expanding into American markets. If you consider it, I could sell my property in Australia and invest in expanding this operation." Marcus felt the world shifting around him again. Two of his children wanted to build their futures on the land that had been his solitary refuge for decades. The ranch that had barely supported one person could potentially become the foundation for a family enterprise that might endure for generations. "Two partners would change everything," he said, thinking out loud. "We need to expand the cattle operation, improve the facilities, probably build additional housing." Dmitri raised his hand with a slight smile. "Construction services available at family rates," he said. "I could design and build whatever facilities you need, and I know contractors who could help with larger projects." Elena looked thoughtful. "A larger ranch operation would need better financial management. Yorgos could help with business planning and marketing, and I could consult on food service operations if you ever decide to sell directly to restaurants." Maria was quiet for a moment, then spoke up. "My children would love spending summers here, learning about ranch life and getting to know their grandfather. I could contribute by managing the household operations for a larger family business." Marcus listened to his children enthusiastically planning a future he'd never imagined possible. The isolated ranch where he'd hidden from human connection for decades was being transformed into the focal point for a family enterprise that could involve all 6 siblings in meaningful ways. "This is a lot to consider," he said finally. "Major changes require careful planning. But I'm willing to explore the possibilities if you are." The conversation continued until well past Marcus's usual bedtime, covering everything from zoning requirements to breeding programs to seasonal staffing needs. What emerged was a vision of the ranch as a family legacy that could provide both economic stability and emotional connection for all 6 siblings while maintaining the environmental stewardship that Marcus considered essential. Anna would relocate permanently and become Marcus's primary partner in daily operations. Alexis would sell his Australian holdings and invest in expanding the Montana operation into a significant commercial enterprise. Dmitri would relocate seasonally to oversee construction projects and facility improvements. Elena, Yorgos, and Maria would maintain their primary careers elsewhere, while contributing specialized services and spending extended periods at the ranch with their families. The plan addressed Marcus's deep need to ensure the land's proper stewardship while providing his children with meaningful roles in preserving and extending their family heritage. More importantly, it offered Marcus something he'd never expected to experience: the satisfaction of building something intended to benefit future generations. As the evening wound down, Marcus found himself looking at each of his children with profound gratitude. They had traveled across the world to find him, then chosen to include him in their lives in ways that honored both his solitary nature and their need for family connection. "Sophia would be proud of what you've become," he told them, "and she'd be amazed to see how you've managed to heal something that was broken before you were even born." Elena wiped tears from her eyes. She always said that love finds a way to complete itself, even when it seems impossible. I think this is what she meant. The next morning, Marcus began the day as he had for 43 years. Coffee at 5:30, weather check from the porch, slow walk to the barn. But everything felt different. The silence was no longer empty, but full of potential. The solitude was no longer permanent, but temporary, a brief pause before his children arrived for another day of shared work and growing connection. As he watched the sunrise paint his pastures with golden light, Marcus realized that he was looking at the same landscape through entirely different eyes. This was no longer just his personal refuge from a complicated world. It was the foundation for a family legacy that would extend far beyond his own lifetime, managed by people who shared his blood and his commitment to the land's proper care. The transformation seemed impossible, but Marcus had learned that impossible things happened regularly when people chose love over fear, connection over isolation, and hope over resignation. At 68, Marcus Sullivan was beginning the most important chapter of his life. He was finally, truly, no longer alone.